They have recognised now that there are some cases that cannot be tried in a criminal court because of the nature of the material. I think we have a solution that we can live with and which will be just sufficient to protect national security.
That's former security advisor Lord Carlisle. I didn't know he was former. That's what it says here in the notes. I thought he still was. But I may be behind the times. Anyway, there are critics of the reforms to the control order system that Tom Brake was boasting about just a few minutes ago on behalf of the Lib Dem Conservative coalition government. Some people say that they have bottled the chance to make major reforms. But Lord Carlisle likes it anyway, so I suppose that's something. I'd rather rely, myself, on the point of view of my next guest. Afua Hirsch is the Guardian's legal affairs correspondent. She knows a thing or two, believe me, about the legal system in this country, and I'd prefer to hear what she thinks of the changes that have been made. Afua, thanks for coming on the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Now, the government are, well, at least the Liberal Democrat part of the government, are rather pleased with themselves in the changes that have been made to the control orders system. Indeed, they say they've been scrapped. I've argued that they've merely been changed and the nomenclature may be different, but the essence is the same. What do you think?
I have to agree with you. I mean, I think there are some changes that it is important to recognise. You know, this is a move away from what was at one point basically house arrest to a more relaxed overnight curfew system. And there are other things which do represent quite important relaxations of the scheme. For example, people under control orders will be able to, in most cases now, access the internet, use phone calls. I mean, that is how draconian the previous system was, that they couldn't even use basic communications. But these things really are tinkering, in my view. I think the fundamental principle, which is that somebody can have their liberty seriously restricted without ever having been put on trial, that still remains.
Or even being told why, even being told exactly why.
I mean, there was a Supreme Court, a House of Lords it was then, case in 2009 in which the court said that people had to be told the gist of the case against them. So that represented some progress, because until then they weren't even told the basics of why they were suspected. But we still have a situation where people are not given any details of what's suspected against them, which means they can't refute it, they can't present evidence in their defence. And so essentially, with that only very basic level of information, they are being held under what is still a very restrictive regime.
And yet, and this is the melancholy truth, a Tory government, Tory-led government, has reintroduced more liberty than we had under the last Labour governments.
Yeah, it is. I think a lot of people who've campaigned for civil liberties find themselves in a strange position now, that they do feel that the Tory government is more their friend than Labour were. And it's really, I don't think, something that we should feel particularly proud of the Tories for. Really, it's just a very sad indictment on the previous Labour government, you know, that they did introduce 28 days detention. And one thing that's come out of this review is that hasn't actually been used since 2007. These powers are not needed by the authorities. They were simply put in place because of this frenzied attempt to just impose more authoritarian laws and erode civil liberties. And I don't think Labour have ever been able to come up with a good explanation as to why they did this. And even now, the sad thing is, they're not able to admit what they did wrong. You know, they're still accusing the coalition government of messing around with civil liberties without actually admitting that a lot of this is a mess that they created. And I think that's the really sad thing, that we're still dealing with that legacy today.
Well, Labour spokespeople were attacking these changes from the right. In the week I heard them on the radio, and the great majority, in fact I think virtually every one of Labour's leadership team voted for 90 days incarceration, which is effectively internment for terror suspects in the last Parliament.
Well, I think it's important to remember the backstory to control orders. If you'll remember, the initial law that was brought in actually provided for indefinite detention without trial, and we saw people interned in Belmarsh with no trial and no charge.
For years.
And that is what led to the introduction of control orders. That was their attempt to try and relax
And the judges
was
forced them
internment.
to
so
do
we
it.
started at a point which is almost unimaginable now that a government would try and introduce indefinite detention without trial. But that was what Labour initially wanted to do and did for a time.
Well, they did until the judges stopped them. I mean, we have a situation where the greater friends of liberty in the country are senior judges and Tories. It's almost impossible to compute.
Well, I think the role of the courts has always been to scrutinise the executive, and the courts have always played that role in trying to check governments when they take their powers too far. But I think the courts feel that the burden has been increasingly on them, and they've had to be more audacious than ever before under the Labour regime. And they feel uncomfortable that constitutionally it's not their role to really be overturning legislation that's passed by Parliament, which leads to the question as to why our democratically elected representatives are introducing these laws where public opinion is so against them. And in part it's because they've been flamed up with this view that there's a balance between civil liberties and national security, and that of course is a fallacy. There is no balance between national security and civil liberties. Civil liberties are an absolute guarantee, and if they're not an absolute guarantee, there's no point in them. So the idea that there's somehow a trade-off and that to be safe we need to just chip away at civil liberties is really a nonsense, and that's one thing that the coalition government claim that they understand. But to me, this new control orders regime is really the first serious test of that, because if the new government really believes that civil liberties are non-negotiable, then they need to address the fundamental problem with this, which is that people who are described by them as terrorist suspects are not being put on trial. Evidence is not being presented in a way that it can be scrutinised by the courts in the process that's at the heart of our system. And until that happens, I don't think that the coalition can really claim the moral high ground on protecting our civil liberties.
Terrific. Afua Hirsch, the Guardian's legal affairs correspondent. I'm backing her. Where do you stand?